Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is episode 3 of Hotcakes with Kate. I'm Kate. Hello. Welcome. It's been another week. Another week has flown by. Holy shit. That was crazy. Anyways, I digress. Hello. Welcome. What have you guys been up to? Shit just keeps happening, doesn't it? So is life. But welcome! Today we're gonna talk about very interesting things. I'm so excited. But first, some ramblings of the week. Went to our friend's EP release this last week, and I swear to God, I thought I saw Patrick ASMR in attendance. And if you do not know, I love ASMR. It is like my favorite thing in the whole entire world. And I listen to it every single night. And I probably would even go so far as to say that I am addicted. So yeah, I thought I saw Patrick ASMR in attendance at this show that I went to. And I feel so bad because in retrospect, I realize I was staring this guy down in this like dimly lit little venue. And I realize now it was not him. And so I feel bad for the guy. Lucy, she's trying to lick my coffee.
Lick my coffee.
She's trying to lick my coffee. But yeah, I swear to God, this is me with my, I'm not drinking right now. So I'm the queen of what do you call them, Chloe, that we have? Seltzer and lime or soda lime. Oh my gosh. I'm tripping over my words heavily. Anyways, what I was saying, I'm not drinking right now, so I'm the queen of soda and lime, okay? And so here I am with my soda and lime, and I'm enjoying the show. Off to the side, I think I see Patrick ASMR, and I literally, full frontal, am staring at this man because I'm like, oh my God, if it's him, I am going to tell him how much I love his ASMR, of course. But then I realized how much I was staring at this poor man, and anyways, oh my gosh, too much rambling about Patrick ASMR. Patrick, if you're watching this, I love your stuff. It's not dumb because the poor guy always talks about how he's so hard on himself. And I love his stuff. So if you're watching this, I love your ASMR, dude. Keep it up. Anyways, my goodness, on that note, I also wanted to talk about, because in writing this down for Ramblings of the Week, I remembered something that happened to me when I was in college, and it is probably one of the most mortifying things that has ever happened to me in my motherfucking life, okay? I was living alone in an apartment at the time. I was a junior in college. And the night prior to this happening, I had stayed up late and was on my computer, and I happened to put something called boyfriend ASMR on my computer. And if you're not familiar with boyfriend ASMR, well, it's pretty much what the name implies. It's just ASMR of like a pretend boyfriend. Oh my God. It's okay, we've all been there. I am not one to judge, especially about myself, because I have. Anyways, so yeah, I was listening to boyfriend ASMR on my computer. I happened to fall asleep, and I woke up in the morning, packed my stuff up to go to lecture, went to my lecture. Mind you, my morning lecture in this lecture hall was huge. It was massive, probably 100 people. And I sit down, and I'm ready to start getting to work, and I open up my computer. And as I open up my computer, the boyfriend ASMR that is on my computer starts to fucking play in this huge lecture hall. Oh my God, I was so mortified. And so once it starts playing, I obviously close the laptop right away and I look around. Mind you, the sounds coming from this boyfriend ASMR is like breathing, okay?
Oh God.
It's like, if anything, it's literally, what? Chloe. Louis doesn't like it. If you can't tell, Louis doesn't pot at me. No, basically, boyfriend ASMR is just, oh my goodness.
Oh, he wants to be with you. Is that okay?
Yes, that's fine. Boyfriend ASMR, the stuff I listen to is just like breathing. And so I don't know if it's reminiscent of, because I grew up sleeping with my sister like growing up, so I don't know if it calms me to hear someone else breathing next to me. I don't know if that's the reason, but I open it up and it's like
Oh God.
and so I instantly close it. I was mortified. I was so mortified. And I look around. I don't think anyone noticed that I was listening to it, but anyways, I thought of that and I was like, holy shit, that is so, oh my gosh. Next topic. Hello, Lewis. Next topic is the topic of aliens and how, particularly, aliens have actually been proven to exist, and I feel like we moved on very quickly from that. However, I do understand why we moved on so quickly, because if the aliens are not going to help, do I give a shit? No, I got my own stuff to take care of, okay? I got my own business to tend to. I don't give a shit unless the aliens are going to help me pay rent. I don't give a shit unless the aliens are going to give me free healthcare. You feel me? So I had that thought. Please, aliens, if you hear me, come down, save us, aliens, please, please, please.
Like the girl.
That fucking meme, Donald Trump. Save me, Donald Trump.
The TikToker where she's talking to Joopy.
Oh my gosh, yeah. It's Joopy, right?
Joopy the alien.
Joopy the alien.
She's freaking brilliant.
Yeah, she is. Those TikToks are funny. On that note, basically how I was thinking about this, how evolution on Earth made it to where the predators have eyes on the front of their skulls, on the front of their face, basically so that they can chase after their prey. And the prey creatures evolved to have eyes on the side to basically keep like a wide berth and to like really scan out for the predators. And so I'm thinking, that's how it was on Earth. What is it like on other planets with life? If I should throw in an if, but even then, that's so ridiculous. The universe is endless. There has got to be other life forms. Anyways, I digress. That's a whole other topic. But what I was thinking is, on these other planets, what if evolution, what if they don't even have eyes? What if they have eyes on their butts? What if they don't even have butts, for that matter? What if they don't even defecate? These are the questions I am so curious about. And I don't know, our span of what aliens could be like is literally just comparable to us, and that's what we compare them to, because that's all our minds can really come up with, really, because it's the whole, I don't know. Anyways, tying in with the aliens thing, I read this a while ago, but it's the theory that, quote unquote, humans are space orcs, meaning that because we have advanced so fast with technology, humans have the capability of basically taking over the whole entire galaxy. And pretty much like orcs in I don't know, World of Warcraft? I don't know which one it is, which one it's comparable to, but basically saying that humans have the capacity, because of their intelligence and because of their technological advances, that humans have the capacity to take over the galaxy. So, I don't know. Truthfully, I think this is very self-grandiose. Like, I was thinking it had to have been like some random white dude that came up with this, because why would you want to colonize the galaxy? What is tempting about that when this whole planet is here for us? I don't understand. It's very, very interesting to me. So yeah. Okay, well, that's ramblings of the week. I don't know. What else has happened this week, Chloe? That's like, in a sense of the world. I don't know. What is there to say? Just gotta keep smiling through it all. Am I right? Am I right, ladies? Okay. The historical topic of today is actually, I was going to do Operation Condor, like I said, but as I started doing research for it, I realized, man, this is very, one, it's not a light subject. It's probably akin to one of the darker aspects of modern history. And so I really want to do it justice when I do it. And so, yeah, I'm just going to leave it at that. I actually might have to do it in parts if I actually do happen to do a section on Operation Condor. So, anyways, I instead decided to do something a little bit more on the fun side because of, in light of recent happenings in the world. I don't know. Before I start with the historical topic, I just want to point out my shirt. It says Indian Girls Book Club, and I love it so much. So yeah, go check them out. They're a nonprofit organization made by Kinsell Drake. Love her so much. Yeah. Good cause. Yes. Okay. Anyways, I digress. This is the historical topic of the week. The history of rebellious fashion. Ooh, little round of applause.
Yay!
Okay. Also, if I'm looking down a lot, it's because I have notes on my computer. So that is what I'm looking at. So I can be as accurate as I can.
I'm wearing pants.
I love wearing pants. Well, you can thank your foremothers for that. Is that a saying? I don't know. A little preface. This is going to be heavily focused on the rebellious trends and acts of fashion history in the contemporary and Western sense, okay? And how change, though most of the time vehemently opposed, will always happen. Change will always happen. The status quo will always be challenged. And ultimately, change will always become embraced and even championed. Crazy how the outcasted suddenly becomes the accepted. Isn't that insane? So in saying that, I'm not really going to talk about classic looks or the hot fashion of the decade because that's not the rebellious aspect of it. I'm going to be focusing on the fashion trends that directly challenged the status quo because that's how we moved. I don't know. That's how change comes about. It's when people decide to finally go against the grain. But I will say, maybe for a pod, I could do the history of contemporary fashion because, of course, it's still interesting to me, at least. I don't know. But this one is strictly for the babes going against the grain. All right. I should put in there another tidbit. This is not really centered around men's fashion. There's bits, of course, because within the rebellious acts of fashion, men were a part of it. But a lot of it is kind of away from the traditional masculine look, pretty much because that is the status quo. Historically, the traditional masculine look pretty much is the baseline for the status quo. So we're not going to really be focusing on that. Before we start, I want to ask a question. When you think of someone wearing, say, a scarf, a beret, those little sunglasses, perhaps you're walking in a city and you see them sitting outside a quaint cafe, drinking a cup of coffee, having a smoke on a cigarette. When you look at them, just an innocent question, what kind of music do you think they listen to? What do you think their hobbies are? Or, adversely, what if you're at a county fair and you see someone wearing bell-bottom jeans and a fringe jacket and you see them with platform heels? What kind of hobbies do you think they would have? Or what kind of music do you think they would have or like? The reason I'm saying this is because fashion and music are intrinsically linked. In some cases, you quite literally can't have one without the other. It's fascinating and it's beautiful. Humans are so multidimensional. Music is the catalyst for so many things. And fashion is the catalyst for so many things. They're like, I don't know, you can't have one without the other in so many aspects. And that's just it's so fascinating. And I think people forget how society as a whole, how many, as I was saying, multidimensional. There's so many different things intersecting with one another. It makes everything is connected in a way. And so that's what I find interesting. Anyways, let's get into it. Also, if I miss anything or if I mess anything up, I apologize and let me know, please, because I tried to keep in most of the important things. Rebellious fashion trends, I mean. But I digress. Let's begin. So, prior to the late 19th century and even the early 20th century, social etiquette was ridiculously strict regarding women's clothing and what was acceptable when one was out and about. Think women wearing dresses, underskirts, or petticoats, and on top of that, incredibly and sometimes painfully tight corsets. Of course, if you didn't constrain to what the social standard was, yeah, expect to be judged. Okay, and expect to be outcasted and expect to be have this moral superiority complex put down on you because you are not following it. A lot of time, the judging, like I was saying, came from a superiority standpoint. Women who dressed modestly were better than women who did not or could not afford to. So this led to a women's rights activist named Amelia Bloomer, and she began to make a case for women to throw away the tight corsets and petticoats worn under the skirts that just added a ridiculous amount of weight. She was initially inspired from the Turkish dress, which usually a wide, loose-fitting pant worn under a knee-length skirt. So again, something taken from Eastern culture, but I digress. Aptly named the Bloomer after Amelia herself. And so the Bloomer became a symbol of women's rights in the early 1850s and was worn by famous feminists like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. For some reason, there was a public outcry for this little garment. Like I was saying, change is always met with resistance. And so men who were threatened by them for some reason sometimes called women Amazons or male impersonators. Honestly, if a man called me an Amazon, I wouldn't mind. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying? I wouldn't mind. Anyways, in 1920s, there was another large shift. What was happening in the 20s? And I should mention, what happened right before the 20s? Right before the 20s, World War I happened. But what was happening in the 20s? Besides the lavish spending, the parties, and prohibition, women gained the right to vote, people. Yes, actually on my birthday. However, important caveat, only white women got the right to vote, okay? Not to be that girl, but I'm going to come with facts, all right? And sometimes only white women of high status, because there was things such as literacy tests and poll taxes. So even if you were a white woman living in America, if you happened to come from a poor family and you did not have the money, you could not vote. So this is where people like get so uptight. They're like, women got the right to vote. It's like sometimes actually, no, only like literally wealthy, high class women, white women got the right to vote. I digress. Here's some other facts. In a very, very, very condensed nutshell, Native Americans weren't allowed to be United States citizens when the Voting Rights Act passed. So the federal amendment did not give them the right to vote. I want to note a very important activist during this time for Native Americans was, if I mispronounce this, I'm so sorry. Zitkala Sa, a Sioux woman and remarkable violin player. I've actually done a lot of research on her. I've never heard her name spoken out loud. I've only read it, so. But even though the suffragists, this is the funny thing, the suffragists studied Native communities to learn a model of government that included women as equal democratic actors. Because remember, many indigenous tribes prior to Western involvement were matriarchies. But when it came down to it, the suffragists, they did not advocate for indigenous women's right to vote. Shake my head. However, with the Snyder Act of 1924, so 4 years later, American-born Native women gained citizenship. With that sentence in itself, American-born Native women, where the fuck else are they gonna be born?
Oh my God.
But once again, there is another caveat, because people will say, oh, it was so progressive during this time. They do not look at the fine text. There are caveats to everything, people. That's why you need to dig deep. This caveat to keep minorities from the polls until as late as 1962. My father was born in 61. Okay, 1962. Individual states still prevented them from voting on contrived grounds, such as using literacy tests, poll taxes, and claims that residence on a reservation meant one wasn't also a resident of that state. So my great-grandmother was not legally allowed to vote until 1965.
That's insane.
On the other hand, even though native-born Asian Americans had citizenship in 1920, first-generation Asian Americans did not. Therefore, Asian American immigrant women were excluded from voting until the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, nearly 3 decades after. Even though women suffragists such as Dr. Mabel Pinghua Lee worked alongside white suffragists in the years leading up to 1920. And then, of course, most people know about this one, the big one. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 secured the vote for many underprivileged people, Native Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, Latin Americans, even white Americans of the lower classes, because it outlawed the discriminatory voting practices adopted in many states after the Civil War, meaning literacy tests as a prerequisite to voting. Because you guys would be alarmed to know about how many people were actually illiterate. So yeah, some of you guys might be wondering, what does this have anything to do with fashion? Particularly rebellious fashion. Well, as I was saying with music and fashion being intrinsically linked, politics and fashion are also intrinsically linked. Like I've mentioned before, I got my degree in history. When people tell me that books, fashion, music, anything like that is not inherently political, I hate to break it to you, but it is. So, anyways, large sidetrack, but very important history to note. So basically during this time, during women's suffrage, in the half a decade before that, during World War I, women were wearing men's attire during the war. And then, leading into the 20s, there was another major shift with things like the suffragette movement and the still very fresh reminder of World War I and how women entered the workforce. After this, women wanted more practicality to their outfits. They wanted less restrictions. They wanted to move, god damn it. Like what your stupid situationship would say. They wanted something casual, okay? Still, they wore skirts, but they made them more masculine, more loose, and sporty, okay? Basically moving towards an androgynous look. During this time, one of the most influential, and on the other hand, infamous, fashion icons of the 20s was Coco Chanel, who dismissed the feminine style of her time and instead embraced androgynous style. She paved the way towards the growing female empowerment and for menswear-inspired clothing. That feels like sand in my mouth even saying that, because I don't want to put this bitch on a pedestal at all. Because why was she infamous? A little pin in here. Remember, infamous and famous are two different words. Famous meaning you became well known for good things. You became well known for being an athlete, a star, a celebrity, something like that. Infamous is the opposite of famous. It means you became well known for being bad, for being evil, for doing not good things. And in my eyes, Coco Chanel is infamous. But why? Well, to put it very plainly, Miss Coco was a Nazi. Homegirl was indeed not a homegirl and was actually believed to have worked as a spy for the German intelligence agency, the Abwehr, from 1941 to 1944. It worked out perfectly because she happened to live at the Ritz Hotel in Paris during the occupation and at the same time had a romantic relationship with Baron Hans Gunther von Dinklage, a high-ranking German intelligence officer. So, she also attempted to use Nazi race laws to gain control of her perfume company from her Jewish partners and was known to make anti-Semitic remarks. All in all, she has never publicly apologized for her actions that may or may not have costed the lives of any number of people during the occupation. So, remember that the next time you see Coco Chanel in a store, or I don't know. I actually, in my defense and other people's defense, I only found out about this probably in the last couple years. So it's shitty. Because this isn't like an end if or but scenario. It is. Like, she is literally, she's a Nazi. So it's unfortunate. I digress. Moving into the 30s. What was happening in the 30s, people? It was after the Roaring 20s. The 30s, subsequently, was the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl and disparity and starvation and the wealth gap between the elites in the country and the average American citizen was the largest it has ever been in the country's history. Until now, I believe. And so in the 30s, we began to see incredibly famous actresses such as Marlene Dietrich, Audrey Hepburn, and Katharine Hepburn wearing things like suits and bow ties in their popular movies. This was the first time it has ever been done. And these women wore these men's suits on the big screen. Although these actresses were sporting pants, it was really only socially acceptable for women to wear pants in very specific situations, such as during high activity things like sports or even something more drastic, like during the wars, when they took over many of the men's jobs. So quite literally, women weren't socially allowed to wear pants unless there was a fucking war going on. Like I was saying, this was the Great Depression. So while these actresses in the elite were in bougie gowns and attending lavish parties, the majority of the American public were poor and heavily affected by lack of work, lack of food, and lack of material for clothing in general. And so that's where you see things such as potato sack clothing, where women would take the sacks out of grain, potatoes, anything, and make clothes out of it because they had nothing. So moving on into the 40s. First, I'm going to preface in 1939, the same year that World War II broke out in Europe, Vogue illustrated a woman for the first time wearing a pair of pants on the cover. The editor's note said, quote, "Our new slacks are irreproachably masculine in their tailoring, but women have made them entirely their own by the colors in which they order them and the accessories they add." That sounds great, right? Once again, another caveat to not go over the top, okay? Remember, you're a woman. You absolutely cannot look too masculine if you wear pants. Heaven forbid. Within the issue, it states that one iron rule is that they are well cut and well creased to appear properly feminine, and stresses the necessity to avoid the mannish accessories that characterize the early experimental days of trouser wearing. So basically, women could wear pants, but again, remember, you have to look fucking pretty. You can't look too mannish. You gotta look nice. Okay? Also, as a result of World War II, the U.S. economy experienced a tremendous uptick in wealth, in jobs, and basically home life in general. So, moving on, 40s, 50s, post-war and ultra-femininity. So the post-war era, all of those bounds made in women wearing pants in the workforce, after the war ended, it pretty much came to a complete fucking halt. Women went back to domestic life. The baby boomer era, the prime era of the housewife, the so-called golden age of America. Well, do I have some stats for you? Domestic abuse was socially acceptable for husbands to commit against their wives until the 1970s. There were no consistent legal consequences for men who abused their partners, and legal in a sense that police often dismissed reports of domestic abuse as private family matters. Look at the Chase and Sanborn coffee advertisement that was featured in Life magazine in 1952. I'll put it up on the screen here if you're watching on YouTube, but this isn't the only ad. There's hundreds more glorifying, basically, this. On top of that, women had no financial autonomy. So most of the time depended on their spouse for financial stability. And before the Equal Credit Opportunity Act in 1974, women often needed a male co-signer to apply for credit cards or loans. 1974, people. How old's your mom? How old's your grandma? This shit is recent. It's like people get history blindness. I needed a male co-signer to apply for credit cards or loans. And then I also read that, say a woman did go in there by herself, they often were berated with ridiculous questions like, are you ever going to have kids? Or are you ever going to get married? Why are you here alone? Why are you single? Why are you divorced? Things like that. In New York, it was until 1966 that their state government made beating a spouse grounds for divorce. And in 1967 was when Maine opened one of the first shelters in the U.S. for victims of domestic abuse. On top of all of this, a lot of the blame was on the woman's part, with questions like, what did you do to make him hit you? Or something adjacent to that. Or the stigma following a woman who happened to be divorced during this time. So, what golden age are we talking about? Based off what I just listed, to me that does not sound like a golden age. That sounds like a fucking hellhole. Okay. After the war and the return to the domestic, the 50s subsequently, were hyper feminine. Okay, clothes were made to accentuate a woman's hips and bust, tight-waisted dresses and curved jackets. However, this is so funny because, again, pinup girls were incredibly popular during this time. Still, they were very popular during the 40s, during the war era. However, they were still very popular well into the 50s and 60s. I think, honestly, pinup girls have always been popular. Because you know what? Sex sells. And that's what... It's ridiculous how people are, like, trying to shield their eyes from it. Anyways. But, of course, during times of rigidity within a... Oh, my God. Of course, during times of rigidity within a society, there are the outliers who choose to go against the norm. Some of the alternative fashion styles of the 50s and 60s were, and this is where I'm kind of going to go, from the 50s onward, I'm kind of going to list it as sections, because, mind you, I'm focusing on the trends. And if there's some politically adjacent things, I'm going to add it in there. Okay, we're going to begin in the 50s with the beatnik style. This style, the question I asked before we even talked about this, you know, the person wearing a beret, scarf, little sunglasses, that's beatnik style. So this emerged as a direct reaction against mainstream, cookie-cutter American culture and was described to be a rejection of materialism and conformity. It was simple. The color pattern was often black, and many wearers favored comfortability and functionality. You're going to notice a theme across all of these decades. Comfortability, functionality, and androgynous. Those are the themes across the board. Because for some reason, I don't know what it is. When people challenge the status quo, they just want to be fucking comfortable. I don't know what it is. So, anyways, I digress. Think berets, sunglasses, loafers. It's giving gloom. It's giving French. It's giving spoken word poetry and snapping. This style prided themselves on intellectualism as a form of rebellion. Okay, moving on. Rockabilly style. During this time, rock and roll was beginning to take off, and of course with it, the rejection of this kind of music as evil. Again, another case made that even though it's cool as shit, people are gonna protest against it.
The devil's lettuce of fashion.
The devil's lettuce of fashion. Yeah. So naturally, there was a social, cultural, and fashion shift with it as well. So basically, rockabilly style was the physical embodiment of rock and roll music on a person's body. Tight jeans, high-heeled shoes, leather jackets. Very rustic, yet completely going against the highly feminine style of the time while still being feminine, but in an outward embracing way, not shying away from one's sexuality. Okay, that's why everyone thought rock and roll was so bad. It's because it got the girls moving and grooving. You know, they saw Elvis Presley up there on the stage and they went fucking crazy, okay? And then we have teddy boy and teddy girl style. I love this style. The teddy girls in London completely rejected the traditional aspects of femininity and instead dressed in jackets with rolled up jeans and flat shoes. I'm going to put a picture right here. Edwardian style suits, slicked back hair. You know the drill. In my head, I see the Peaky Blinders, but I'm not sure if there's a correlation. I don't think there is, but that's what I see. But it was seen as a rebellious look by the youth. I just want to do a little important note before we move into the 60s, because a lot of stuff happens in the 60s and onward until the turn of the century, really. During this time, you had things like the Civil Rights Movement, the anti-war movement, the American Indian movement, and the psychedelic drug movement. And groups like the Black Panther Party and the Rainbow Coalition, which I could do a whole bit on just groups during the civil rights movement, but they heavily influenced fashion trends during this time. So I just want to, just so you guys know and remember what was happening during this time, because like I was saying, social happenings, political happenings directly reflect on fashion happenings, okay? So let's begin. Mod style, short for modernist. It started in London and spread throughout Great Britain before eventually bleeding into the trends of other countries as well. Modern. So think of bold colors and graphic prints. It was heavily inspired by pop art and, in turn, Andy Warhol, who was quite the character in 1960s New York. I wrote in here I was going to do an excerpt on him, but there's just so much about him. He, too, could be his own little podcast bit. But he was gay. He was queer, and he was one of the first people to like outwardly express that in a society that was so restrictive of that. You know, he had people like drag queens. He had over at his studio all the time. And so in saying that, mod style was not just about fashion. It was also very enmeshed with music. Bands like The Who, The Kinks, and American R&B music. Yeah, keeping with the theme of going against the hyperfemininity of the time, mod style was often androgynous. Trousers, men's shirts, and loose shift dresses. Could you hear Louis?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Hair in short, sleek cuts, bobs, and pixie cuts. Interestingly enough, this style actually evolved. Did I say that bad? Interestingly. Actually, apparently, I've never been on live television before. Apparently. Ugh, let me re-say that. Interestingly enough, this style actually evolved and associated with the hippie movement and subsequently the psychedelic rock scene.
Wow.
Notice how everything's connected. Very cool. So, moving on, hippie style. We all know what hippie style is, okay? We see it in movies depicting America in the 60s. We see it in music. We see it in media all over the place. Long hair, bell-bottom jeans, platform heels, fringe, tie-dye flowers, peace sign, all that. All of this reflects a back-to-nature mentality, okay? Like I was saying, the psychedelic movement. Everyone was on shrooms, all right? This also led to a large movement towards communal living, vegetarianism, and spirituality, and a lot of obsession with Eastern philosophy during this time. Okay, so things like meditation, yoga, Buddhism, opposing Western societal norms, and championing, right? Sexual liberty. As we, in retrospect, we can see this as somewhat of a slippery slope. See all the weird cults that formed during and after this time. But initially it was a focus on human freedom and comfortability and being oneself and being one's natural self, I suppose. Another fun fact, the hippie movement was kind of a successor of the beatnik movement of the 50s. However, in researching this, I realized there's so many different subgenres of all of these trends. It's so interesting.
It's not linear.
No. Everything it's multidimensional, people. That's why when with things such as intersectionality, it's how many times am I going to say interesting? But it's interesting, okay? So much like mod style, hippie fashion sense was heavily connected to music. Woodstock, literally the largest outdoor festival that has ever happened on Earth, okay? The folk scene, Bob Dylan, Joni Mitchell, Joan Baez, psychedelic rock, the Grateful Dead, rock music in general. Okay, now, probably one of the more interesting to me is the punk proto-style of the 60s. This style actually came about as a way to oppose the hippie movement's utopianism views. Important note, the punk proto-style was actually the predecessor of the classic punk rock style that many people think of when someone asks about punk fashion. This was the predecessor, but to me it's so interesting because it basically laid the groundwork for the punk rock movement that would take place in the mid-1970s. And the proto-style, the punk proto-style was very, this is what encompassed the Black Panther Party, the Rainbow Coalition. A lot of the movements going on during the 60s, a lot of them took part from the punk proto-style. Granted, a lot of them were within the hippie movement, but the punk proto-style is very, very cool. And so you have bands like Velvet Underground, MC5, and Stooges who were associated with this. It challenged the status quo heavily. And basically the status quo at that time was the white standard, basically. Was what wealthy, picket fence white people were wearing. Now we're moving into late 60s and 70s. Important to note that a lot of strife still surrounding war and civil rights issues was going on. Now in American culture, menswear was not really considered rebellious much anymore, thanks to things like the Equal Pay Act and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which gave women more rights in the workplace, allowed for more leniency, and made bounds for people to wear what they motherfucking wanted to. Okay? Women didn't have to wear high heels to work anymore if they didn't want to. They didn't have to wear dresses to work anymore if they didn't want to. They were allowed to wear slacks. They were allowed to wear flat shoes, things like that. Okay. Now I want to put in here something that actually began in the 40s. However, it grew in major popularity and began to take a political connotation in the 60s and 70s along with the civil rights movement, and that is Chicano style, okay? So the word Chicano itself became a way to identify Mexican-American youth with their ethnic identity and struggle for rights. So in turn, and really a reflection on most of these styles, Chicano style began as a way of expressing their struggle through clothing, art, and lifestyle. I'm also going to put in here, just mention the Zoot Suit riots. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but just say that Zoot Suits came about during the war era and post-war era when fabrics were being rationed. And fabrics like wool. And so Zoot Suits were completely made out of wool, and sometimes, most of the time, they were oversized. And so it was very looked down upon to have Zoot Suits, and it led to unrest and the Zoot Suit riots, basically. And honestly, I would love to cover this time period in general as a whole in another pod episode, if you guys would like to hear that. Because pre-war, war, and post-war era, very, very interesting. So anyways, I digress. One of the most recognizable pieces of Chicano style is the flannel shirt, usually with the top button left unfastened. Along with wide baggy pants with a raised waist to emphasize respectability and confidence, these pants became very important in street fashion in the coming years. Another iconic style is the baggy knee-length shorts and long white socks. Women, on the other hand, often wore retro-style dresses or high-waisted tight pants, headscarves, and makeup to emphasize and dramatize one's facial features, like well-defined brows, bright red lips, and winged eyeliner, which I love that. Imagery was also very important to the Chicano style, the most important being the Virgin Mary. Chloe, what is that band that Mom and Dad love so much? They got us that shirt, and it had the really cool image of the Virgin Mary on the back.
It was the Mavericks.
The Mavericks. Yeah, Dad loves the Mavericks. So now, kind of segueing into the 70s, we begin with glam rock. So this began out of the UK, and it was initially a style of rock music, but also characterized by its flamboyant clothing, makeup, and hairstyles of its musicians, described as camp or androgynous, with its wearers playing with the idea of gender roles in regards to fashion. So think David Bowie, Slade, Elton John, Rod Stewart, and Freddie Mercury. A total amalgamation of many different themes here. Hollywood glamour, 1950s pinup sex appeal, pre-war cabaret theatrics, science fiction even, ancient and occult mysticism and mythology. Okay, so a huge combination of so many different genres. Most noted for its sexual and gender ambiguity. Like I said, androgynous is huge with all of these movements. So, glam rock inspired movements like the New Romantic movement, which began as an underground fashion subculture in nightclubs in the late 70s. Very cool. Okay, now moving on to one of the more well-known kind of rebellious fashion trends of recent history is punk rock. So the punk rock scene in the 70s emerged as a direct... Did I say that weird?
No.
Emerged as a direct, raw, and rebellious response to the productions of mainstream rock music. Which is so crazy to me. Because rock music in itself was heavily criticized, but then it became... Anyways, I'll get into that. Deliberately outrageous and famously anti-establishment for wearers of this, it wasn't just a statement, but their own sense of personal resistance. Coming out of the underground music scenes of New York City and London, punk rock bands rejected the corporate nature of mainstream rock. Which is so funny, because looking back at when rock itself was starting, it had very similar beginnings to punk rock before becoming commercialized. Oh my God. Before becoming commercialized and for profit. So kind of like a full circle moment. Kind of like the whole reason you see the hippie movement, people wanting peace, love, and granola, but then that becomes commercialized. Punk rock fashion was often simple yet disheveled. Ripped jeans, faded t-shirts, and leather jackets. Began seeing body modification as a statement, things like piercings and tattoos, bold hairstyles, spiky hair, mohawks, and bold makeup. Deeply rooted in do-it-yourself spirit, meaning handmade and altered clothing, often featured patches and safety pins to hold clothes together. When I think of this, I think of Spider-Punk and Into the Spider-Verse. I love that movie. Okay, before moving into the 80s, a little important note, some things happening during this time. The AIDS epidemic. So, what does that mean? Basically, with the AIDS epidemic came horrible homophobia and misinformation surrounding the disease. And just the lack of response from the government, of course, throughout the 80s and into the 90s was atrocious. So, in the 80s, street style became very prevalent. In general, street style is considered to have emerged not from fashion houses, but from the general population itself. So people's own personal take on style. A lot of times, actually, it's shown that mainstream fashion often appropriates street fashion trends because it's what the people want. And so these fashion houses will look at what people are wearing in the street and say, oh, that's a great look. Let's put it on the next line, right? The perfect place for a person to explore their own self through the action of dress. And I found a quote from a writer for the New York Times, Bill Cunningham, who said, quote, "Streets tell a great deal about fashion and people if one listens." It became quickly popularized with through, and this is a French term, prêt-à-porter. Oh my God. Or if someone's French and listening to this, I'm so sorry. Became quickly popularized with through prêt-à-porter, or ready to wear, or quote, off the rack. So this is also kind of when fast fashion started coming on the scene. So you have the quote unquote teenager who has money to spend and chooses to express themselves. So some key places where street style was heavily emerging: Milan, Paris, Japan, London, New York, India, and LA. All right, moving on to post-punk. So post-punk initially emerged in 1977 as a requisite of the punk rock scene. So again, post-punk was more about departing from punk's initial fundamental elements and raw simplicity, and instead adopting an experimental approach closely related to avant-garde and non-rock influences. So again, Even if punk was a reflection and a direct response to the commercialization of rock and roll, post-punk was kind of a challenge against the punk movement itself, as they felt the movement eventually became disillusioned and had fallen into a commercial formula and self-parody. So another full circle moment. Is it?
Yeah.
Okay, so basically post-punk was a blend of practical and comfortable working class elements. Initially, it was very similar to its predecessor, punk, with elements of individuality with patches and pins. But the goal was to challenge norms and express a spirit of rebellion, as is the goal, I feel, is most of these trends. Okay, so I'm just going to touch briefly on this. I do feel like it's important, but I'm just very brief. The club kid era of the 80s and 90s. This era emerged from the nightlife of New York City. Artistic and fashion-conscious youth, known for appearances on daytime talk shows, magazine editorials, fashion campaigns, and music videos. And across the board, they're actually given the credit for being the predecessors for things like reality TV, self-branding, and the quote-unquote gender revolution. And so that's why I wanted to list them in here, because even though it was a very brief period of time, it was so influential and so important. You know, you have some of the notable members, including Amanda Lepore, RuPaul, and Michelle Visage. But ultimately, this scene collapsed due to the murder of Andre Angel Melendez. But again, this era left a huge imprint on fashion, especially queer fashion. So I wanted to put that in there. Moving on to another very, very well-known rebellious fashion trend, goths. So initially, goth came around in the UK during the late 70s and 80s. A lot of stuff from the UK, damn. Became more commercially visible in the 90s. Origins came from the Victorian era of fashion with a mysterious, eerie, and dark note. I would say is an offshoot of punk mentality, as it utilizes DIY attitude and challenging societal norms. But, you know, when this came about, of course, there was a very dark connotation with it. Just much like when rock music became a thing, a lot of people believe goths were evil just because they chose to wear all black, which is so insane to me. Classic goth typically includes colors like black, deep purple, red, and sometimes white. Lace, corsets, leather, velvet, and fishnet were very popular embellishments for wearers, along with chokers and even occult or religious symbols were very common. Also, notable to mention, there are so many subgenres of gothic fashion. Literally so many. You have pastel goth, trad goth. There's so many. So honestly, I could talk about goth again because I love fashion history and it's huge. Okay, moving on. Into the 90s, you have the grunge scene. So the grunge scene was a reaction against the polished look of the 80s and aimed to subvert mainstream fashion norms. A lot of times it's also described just what poor and middle class kids were wearing in the Pacific Northwest. Literally flannels, jeans, just shit from a thrift store. But it was made into a trend thanks to bands like Nirvana. Like I was saying, some influential figures in grunge fashion were, of course, Kurt Cobain, specifically for his thrift store look that combined masculine lumberjack workwear. Grunge fashion, I do believe, has actually made a comeback in recent years, aka me in college. That's like literally all I fucking wore, with designers incorporating elements of the style into modern pieces. This resurgence has also been driven by Gen Z's desire to express individuality and rebel against societal expectations. So next is one of my favorite fashion styles ever, and that's the hip-hop style of the 90s. Initially, it emerged in the late 70s, but gained heavy traction in the late 80s and 90s. Of course, there was some pushback from it because it was thought of as quote-unquote thug wear and associated with gang violence. So initially, it was rejected by mainstream fashion in American culture, but due to an influx of cultural influence through music, television, athletics, and media, it became highly popularized and even associated with luxury brands like Gucci, Versace, and Fendi. Very important to note, this style was made popular by people of color, particularly African Americans. and with it saw the resurgence of historically African American hairstyles like afros, cornrows, and dreads. To me, it was the epitome of cool and sleek while also being comfortable. It's a blend of streetwear, luxury brands, and cultural influences. Baggy jeans, oversized t-shirts, Timberland boots, often paired with gold chains, bucket hats, or Kangol caps, plaid shirts and jackets, and this word, dungarees. Dungarees? I think that's how you pronounce it. I digress. Another important note, that a lot of mainstream trends were set by people dressing in this style. So rappers in the 90s transitioned from musicians to fashion trailblazers. Again, another little link between music, society, culture, and fashion. Examples of male rappers could be Ice Cube, Eazy-E, Tupac, LL Cool J, and Biggie Smalls. However, I found a fantastic Reddit thread highlighting many all-female hip-hop and rappers in the 90s that heavily inspired fashion. So for women, hip-hop fashion was arranged from more conservative yet feminine looks that singers like Lauryn Hill and Eve sported versus hyper-glamorous and more open looks introduced by Kimora Lee Simmons. Other important examples are Salt and Pepper, Queen Latifah, Da Brat, Lil' Kim, and Foxy Brown, and like I was saying, even Lauryn Hill. I feel as though this style has made a lasting impact on fashion and culture in general and continues to do so. It literally sets the tone for fashion and streetwear and pop culture in general. Consistently, hip-hop style and fashion are within the mainstream media nowadays. Consistently. So, some of these leading into the turn of the century, I'm just going to mention briefly because they're not necessarily rebellious, but you have things of like the minimalist style of the 90s, characterized by its simplicity and understatement pieces in direct response to the very loud fashion sense of the 80s. And really the most scandalous thing about this style I could find was Monica and Rachel from Friends not wearing a bra with their tight, simple t-shirts they often wore. And so you could see their nipples. Literally, that is like, or like, that's like the most scandalous thing about the minimalist style. And then in the 2000s, you have the boho chic style, which was basically a mini resurgence of hippie fashion, floral prints, lace, ruffles, and earthy tones, layered jewelry, wide belts, and scarves. What I want to pinpoint at the turn of the century here was anti-establishment culture post 9/11, and I'm gonna be very careful here because there was a heavy shift towards a more conservative wear in post 9/11 America, and so basically, if you were not abiding by these standards, people were suspicious of you, because how can you not be following the status quo at a time like this? So people went back to the more classic and safe looks. Things like, as an example, would be skater culture, which had been a thing since the 70s, but really blossomed during this time, was pretty much the opposite end of this ultra-nationalistic conservative fashion sense going on. Another important note here, there was also the mortgage crisis of 2008, which resulted in another wave of conservative fashion styles because people could not afford quality pieces. So around this time, the 2000s to 2010s, fast fashion really found its footing. It was fast, it was cheap, and the turnaround was fucking insane. So think of H&M, Forever 21, Shein, Temu, Amazon, must I go on. So yeah, now we're kind of into the present time. And a couple of the trends I've noticed, the biggest one being athleisure. It's not rebellious at all. It's, if anything, I don't know, but I'm going to just put it, I wanted to note it because of its massive popularity. Lululemon, Alo Yoga, Fabletics, just the whole movement around fitness and fashion and the merging of that in general is very interesting. And I am such a hoe. Like, I'm guilty of this, okay? I love athleisure for the most part because it's comfortable. And I don't know. So that's athleisure wear. It's still going on, actually. I do believe there's some bits of it finding itself in high fashion, which is insane. Lastly, I will end with a current trend I and many other individuals I have seen on social media have noticed in American culture, and that is the trend towards returning to the quote-unquote golden age of America fashion-wise, or just very conservative fashion styles in general. So again, this is tied with cultural and political happenings. This trend is in a direct response to the election results, and at Paris Fashion Week, there was a lot of pieces highlighting a sort of revival of conservative styles. So sort of this rise and emphasis on old money aesthetics. So think trends inherently rooted in traditional notions of quote unquote taste. Traditional notions of taste. Putting an emphasis on timelessness, elegance, and authority through fashion. What does that sound like? Using fashion as a status symbol. It's giving Gilded Age, it's giving post-war era, it's giving hyper-femininity, it's giving the 50s, okay? So that's just something I've noticed, a trend as of late. And then I'm going to list just some iconic figures in rebellious fashion throughout the 21st century. I mentioned Marlene Dietrich. She wore a men's trouser suit in the 30s. She was great. Cher, okay? Highly promiscuous for the time and was fucking rocking it. She was so cool. She still is. If you haven't seen some of her looks, please go look them up. They're fabulous. Grace Jones, also fabulous. Very well known for her flamboyant stage looks. David Bowie, goes without saying. Elton John, also goes without saying. However, this next person literally could not find any website that would list him on any of it, and it's Dennis Rodman. Okay, incredibly skilled athlete, but also beloved in the alt fashion scene for his rebellious looks. He literally wore a fucking dress. I love him. He's not on one website I could find about any rebellious fashion looks, which is insane to me. Of course, you have Madonna, Selena, Lady Gaga, the meat suit. Must I say more? And then some more modern contemporary examples. I put down Alex Consani, and she's fabulous. And I do believe she recently won Model of the Year. So that is a perfect example. And then I'm going to end with Chapel Roan, who I truly believe she is the spearhead of this new wave of alt fashion and just, I don't know, being a champion of your own identity, if that makes sense. So here are some closing thoughts. In literally every generation, the younger generation rebels somehow, somewhere, somewhat against the prior generation. But for the most part, it's in benefit of change. And yet people are still shocked by this rebellious nature, particularly older folks, even though they may have participated in it when they were young. So when I say this, I think of the boomers, who may or may not have participated in the hippie movement, or Gen X, who participated in the club kid movement, or something like that. But then they're shocked when rebellious acts from the younger generation happens. I don't know. I mentioned this, fast fashion, athleisure wear. And then it's important to note, of course, there's events like the Met Gala, Golden Globes, Grammys, the Oscars, and many, many other events that celebrities and others choose to make fashion statements. Okay? I didn't want to list these because that in itself could be a whole nother episode. So yes, as kind of like a closing statement, remember, if you don't think fashion, something that is so intrinsically tied to our society and culture as human beings, is not inherently political or even political in a historical sense, I really need you to go outside and touch the grass, because, baby girl, in this world, pretty much everything is political. So yeah, I'm just gonna end with this question that I had to myself as I was researching this. Why do we as humans constrain ourselves so much? I understand, there are certain things that are morally not right, obviously. But why do we put so much pressure on ourselves to look a certain way, or to act a certain way, or titles, or just, why do we put so much constraints on ourselves? So I can't help but think of things like birds singing outside, or a doe walking across a field, or even trees growing on a riverbank. There's no constraints to what they are. They just are. And I guess I could be foregoing the whole fact that humans are conscious beings and we have thoughts and feelings and so much history with that. But I don't know. It's just researching all of this fashion history. It makes me, why do we put this much emphasis on it? Why do we make it so hard for ourselves? I don't get it. We have made it to where everything has an implication behind it. And it's just, I don't know. So yeah, that's what I'll leave y'all guys with. So yeah, that was a very brief history of rebellious fashion trends of quite literally just like this last century. So that was quite a bit, but yeah. Anyways, if you guys want to comment something you want to hear, historical topic you want me to talk about, please let me know. I'd love to do it. But yeah, like, subscribe, follow if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or whatever, Spotify, YouTube. And yeah, I'll see y'all next week. This is Hotcakes with Kate. I'm Kate. Peace out, y'all. Love you. Yeah!
Louis, say hello, come here. Say goodbye. Say goodbye, B, even though he's naughty. Say goodbye. He doesn't want to.
Bye, y'all.